Great. So agenda for today, next steps with OMA. Personally for me, I mean, I thought our conversation was good last time and got into some issues, but this is sort of a mini project. And, because Craig is going to be unavailable for some time, I think it'd be good for somebody in the community to sort of pick up that work stream. I'm not saying it has to be you, John, but what do you guys think of that? Because it's going to be hard for me to manage that as well. Oh, there's a bunch of people in the waiting room. Sorry. There we go. Everybody should be available. All right, great. Good to see all of you. We are just kicking things off with the recording. So haven't missed much. Intro to Alex. He works with us at SQL on Cynthia. Really interested. He's starting to write a view runner actually in C++ for Parquet. So that's a pretty cool project. So excited for that. We just started off with talking about what the next steps we should have for the OMOP conversation. And I was suggesting, because Craig is not going to be available for a couple of weeks and we don't want to add more to his plate, I'm sort of looking for a volunteer here to sort of pick up the mantle, at least in the short term.
So I actually do have the opportunity to work on this as part of some projects that I'm involved in. So it's my plan to sort of create like a Kotlin powered FHIR to OMOP conversion as part of that, which will help me learn a lot more about the problem and help me participate a lot more. But that's going to be sort of a medium term thing, I think. So yeah, but I do envision that I can sort of help with that and participate in that discussion and also use it to validate the spec a lot more. I imagine just going through that exercise is really going to tighten up the spec.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's great. And it's great that you have the opportunity to work on that, more directly in terms of a project. So I think you're the last man standing here a little bit, John, at least for the short term, if that you're okay with that.
So is there a meetup focused on FHIR to OMOP that one or more of us should be sort of attending as sort of a crossover?
Yeah, and please, anybody chime in here who knows more about this. But there was a post, I want to say today, from Deveria, who really leads, the FHIR and OMOP community. I won't read it, but you guys can look through it. It's on the OMOP plus FHIR channel on Zulip. Basically, I think they were on sort of a pause and a hiatus, but it's restarting. And I believe they do have weekly calls at Wednesdays, 3 to 4 Eastern. So Craig was on those calls before. So maybe, John, as just a starting point, you get on those calls.
Yeah, okay.
Great.
Are they at the same time for you, John?
That sounds like, so 3 to 4, it sounds like this time, but tomorrow, right?
Yeah, 3 to 4 Eastern.
Yeah, I think that should be fine.
Cool.
Great. Any more thoughts about sort of next step or sort of project planning around, I think we have at least a starting point with John. Okay, moving right along. So John very helpfully a couple of weeks ago put up this list of items. I think a lot of it came from the testing that I'm doing with Pathling. So, up to you, John, how you want to handle it. We could just start top to bottom. And maybe I should ask the group if there's any kind of walk-on topics that people definitely want to discuss today before we get into some details.
I can dive right in, and if anyone thinks of anything, please feel free to jump in. The column type one, I've just been working on that this morning. So I think we've currently got some tests in there, and I posted on this in Zulip, where we have like type assertions through the column type element, but the reference implementation is kind of a bit tolerant of these because of the way that it does it in JavaScript. So, but I think the spec is fine in that respect. So I'm just working on a pull request to modify one of the tests and add some new tests just to actually narrow down that behavior to make sure that, for example, if we're, adding to decimals and we're asserting that it's an integer, that all of that behavior is actually per the spec. So I think that's that one. The expect columns thing. So this was an extra assertion that we sort of came up with to address the column ordering business. So in our test definitions, we don't actually have deterministic column ordering because of the way that we define the tests. And that's fine. We can write test runners that account for that. But we probably also want an additional assertion, expect columns, so that for selected tests, we can actually assert an explicit ordering of columns so that we can test that part of the spec that we actually define a column ordering strategy. So I think the remaining tasks there are to add expect columns into our JSON schema for the tests, and also add a couple of tests where we define a bit of a funky view definition and have an associated column ordering and actually assert it using this expect column so that we can sort of round out that story and say that our definition of how column ordering should work actually is implemented in the particular view runner, if that
makes sense to me. Any questions on that or the previous note about column types through these?
So the JSON first tests and decimal numbers thing, I think, has been resolved. Maybe Igor might know a bit more about this, but I think we had a bit of an issue there where we were actually producing the JSON test definitions from the JavaScript. And because JavaScript has some sort of bizarre way of doing numbers, we couldn't actually have tests which needed to have decimal inputs. Like, for example, for the boundary tests, if we had a decimal that was 1.0 and had to be 1.0, not 1, then we couldn't actually produce that out of the current test infrastructure because JavaScript doesn't care. But I think we've actually, thanks to the Health Samurai guys, we actually switched it around so that the JSON is actually the sort of source of truth, first class artifact, and that all works now. So I think we can actually tick that one off. It was really only a problem for the boundary tests because in the boundary tests actually need to sort of look at the scale of the decimal that you're putting in to figure out the result. So it actually matters whether you say 1 or 1.0 or 1.00. So I think that's been resolved.
Yeah, Igor, do you recall this one? Do you have any comment on it?
Well, yeah. Can you hear me good?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. We ticked it off. It's done. I only can notice that in our reference implementation, we'll need to think about how to actually implement this boundary tests thing because right now, as John said, JavaScript just doesn't really care about after the decimal dot. Well, so we'll need to think about that. But other than that, yes, in the test, it's pretty okay.
So with the respect to the reference implementation and the boundary functions, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason we hadn't implemented this in the reference implementation was because the boundary functions are kind of new and they hadn't been implemented on the main branch of firepath.js, but they were implemented on some other branch and we haven't sort of picked that up. Is that right?
Well, I don't know about the other branch, but as of now, I guess in the master branch, there are still no boundary functions. I'll need to check this out, actually. And maybe we can just grab their implementation, their work in progress implementation, and put it in our reference implementation.
Yeah, so maybe we just need to check the status of whatever the corresponding pull request is for Firepath.js and
We can do that.
Okay, I'll make a note for Igor to just follow up on that for Firepath.
All right.
Or the branch for Firepath for that. So I'll make a to-do for you, Igor.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, Alex, you have your hand up?
Yeah, certainly. And so I'm doing this and making my own Firepath implementation in C++ because as far as I'm aware, there's not one. And I was kind of stuck on what the low and high boundaries should be defined as, like in a general sense. So I have my own, decimal system way of doing decimals. Right now it's a third-party library. But how would I go about implementing the low boundary for a specific number? Because I see in the example it goes from 1 to like 0.95. Is that just a random example? Is that like a accurate possible example?
Yeah. Okay. So okay. So it is in the. I'll post it in the meeting thread here.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing.
yeah, I really struggled actually with this, but I think the spec, the link that I just posted, they've actually, as Ryan was referring to, I think added a few more useful examples, which kind of helps to understand it. And I think they've kind of tightened up the language a little bit in the spec. So take a look at it and just let us know if you have any problems.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm assuming it's for precision issues as what I've read. I've read this blurb before. So like if I have precision to, 18 decimal points or something, maybe I just tick up one and tick down one from there. And that's my range for high and low boundary. I'll have to ask them more specifically, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's designed to kind of smooth out the problems of trying to do this stuff across lots of different implementations that have lots of different sort of constraints with respect to precision and all that sort of stuff, which actually fits our use case quite well. But yeah, it is a little bit tricky to get your head around in the first instance. Okay, so the where definition thing, I think we can also tick off. So this was about just tightening up the language a little bit about the type of, like the required type or otherwise of the where paths in the actual view definition. So that was a pull request and that was merged. So I think we can remove that from the list.
Sounds good.
Schema inference. I think this needs to be a GitHub issue. So you can put an action on me to turn this into a GitHub issue. I think all it is a line in the spec which says implementations of view runners should provide interrogating the schema of a result effectively, or providing the schema of that the result will be. And that could be done in all sorts of different ways, but it is quite an important capability because if you want to be able to accommodate the result, you kind of have to know what it will look like. And different view runners will be doing different processes in terms of actually mapping the types that come out of a view definition into the implementation specific types and all the rest of it. And I don't think we want to go into the details of how they actually communicate that schema information to the user, but we want to say that they really should, because that's going to be important for people who want to pick up the result and do it for onward processing or persist it. So I think there's a GitHub issue there to sort of add a one-liner into the spec somewhere to sort of say that.
Yeah, thanks for that summary. Yep, and just for the group, I think a bunch of folks weren't in. I think it was 2 weeks ago. We had a pretty extensive conversation around this. I would say that was totally came to a conclusion on it, but yeah, I just wanted to put it out to the broader group about the idea here, right? That John points out. And I think there was also a Zilla thread where we talked about this a little bit. Just I wouldn't even call it, I may want to change the name from schema inference here to just, support, schema outputs or definition or something like that. I think the language might be a little bit, we might want to change the language there. But otherwise, what John said was the concept that, a group of us, not everybody necessarily aligned to. And, we think it does. I personally think it's really important for, having SQL on FHIR systems be a part of ETL pipelines and an ecosystem of data systems, essentially. So I think it's going to be really interesting and important in CI and CD and automation systems. So that's my own personal view, but I'll hand it over to Bishi.
Thanks, Arjun and John. And I apologize, I joined late because it took me a while and then Zoom crashed my browser. So for some reason. So I missed the part for column types. So I appreciate if someone can just summarize that, but I think it's also related to this schema inference. Like what we discussed 2 weeks ago was, if I remember correctly, was just like a recommendation that, the implementations should support this without getting into too much detail, if I remember correctly. Are we still saying the same thing? Or because in particular, I think we were saying that, the issue of inferring column types is kind of separate from a schema. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, I think that's what John said, is that this is spec guidance, right? Essentially a one-liner that says like should without further elaboration.
Yeah, I don't think we can say must actually, because, and I come back to this horrible sort of CSV runner type example, and I should just write a CSV runner just to illustrate some of the problems with this. But, it doesn't really have a schema or really types or anything. It's just a dumb sort of thing. But it's also kind of a valid use case as well. So I think we need to say should, because certainly things like Spark, things like Postgres, whatever, absolutely should have this capability in order to be useful. Ryan?
Yeah, I think that, making this, that we tend to get in this blurry distinction with regards to which schema means and the context and namespace. But yeah, I think John, I think I totally agree with your perspective, and we just want to be clear that all of the column names and column types should be clearly defined, in the view definition. I mean, and it's required if you use that shareable view definition profile that we've added a few weeks ago. So yeah, you should know all the column types from a standards perspective there should be concrete and well defined. Now that doesn't solve the problem that you're alluding to as well, is like, how exactly does that map to my Parquet schema or my Spark data frame or my whatever my output is? And so that by nature will be very system specific, because I just listed system specific technologies. So yeah, I think that's sort of like subtly a nuance there would be important to capture. And I'm fine. I mean, I'd be happy to take a pass at adding that clarification to the spec too, if you prefer. I can put up a pull request on GitHub kind of along these lines. But yeah, I think we're on the same page there.
I mean, Ryan, just a question on that. I can't think of everything in the schema in the spec, but like, do we think that just needs to be stronger, right? Like, do you think, is that what you're suggesting? It's kind of make that a stronger point in the spec? These are well-defined types in a view definition.
I mean, yeah, I think that we might be able to emphasize that. I mean, if it's, well, maybe we can emphasize that. I mean, I can look at ways of emphasizing that, and even like from the headliner, it's like the notion of only recently did we add this degree of strength with regards to the requiring column type definitions and via a profile. So I think that we can make that a little more front and center if we're comfortable with like the shareable view definition that you can see in the currently version of the currently posted version of the draft. But yeah, we can emphasize that front and center. Say, hey, every column name and FHIR type are well defined in the view definition itself, provided that you implement that it satisfies the shareable view definition profile. How those map to your system specific will depend on the implementation, but implementations should define a way to produce the schema given a view definition to meet those use cases. And yeah, I think that folks who really want to use the CSV schema will see that doesn't make sense for them, and that's fine. So yeah, I'm fine with taking that to do and putting up a pull request, and I can drop a discussion in the issues or the chats.
I've documented a to-do for you there, Ryan, and it seems like I'm taking a look back at previous notes. You, Ryan, had a CSV mode profile to do for CSV mode profile, but John apparently wants to take on that mantle, but I'll let you guys fight it out to see who gets to pick that one.
Yeah, I don't recall. I maybe lost track of the CSV mode runner, but yeah.
That's fine. I'm sure one of you will do it. So John, just looking at your list.
Sorry, I apologize again. Do you mind just let me know what was the summary for the column type, like quickly? Again, sorry that I joined late. So what was the topic, the column type? Yeah.
So I can have a go at, so this is my understanding. In the base view definition, it's optional, but if you put a type in, the implementation should check it. And if it doesn't agree with what is the actual result, is that we should throw an error. However, if you want this view definition to be shareable, you should have types on every column. Right. And the idea behind that is that if you actually want the view definition to be able to reliably translate across different view runners, you really need to be asserting the type in the view definition. Have I got that
right? And that's, I think, something that we can make more front and center, because this is something after some discussion, I added this profile. So it's depicted as a logical model here, but it's really a profile of the view definition itself. And in this profile, it actually adds the constraint that like column and type, it promotes that to a required field, because you can see like the differential table from the root there. And so therefore, this is making explicit, hey, you have to have column type information set for it to pass the shareable view definition. And therefore, like, this is like that concrete type. And so I think that'll be our mechanism there. But I think we want to emphasize that's how it's made concrete, which doesn't solve the other half of the problem of like mapping that to a schema or a technology specific schema, which is, as John pointed out, like going to be a implementation specific strong recommendation. You should do this. There should be a way to take a FHIR view definition and produce your Parquet schema or whatever it is. But the details for that would not be in the core specification, at least not in this time, because it will be technology specific.
Thank you both. And again, I should have discussed this when you send the pull request for shareable view definition. Again, apologize for that. but didn't agree that the type is still optional in the sense that even for shareable, in the sense that if it's not present, then it's a string.
Well, actually, yeah. Well, that's something that we can discuss. I had actually made it to so my interpretation of it is like if something was shareable, we would just add that type tag to everything hard stop. I mean, just kind of make it completely explicit, it's a bit more work to create a shareable view definition according to this. So yeah, I mean, but we can discuss that. It's certainly easier in the profile validation to just make it a hard requirement. So right now, as this is written up, it is a hard requirement for every field, even if it is a string. In the other cases, but we can discuss whether that it should be the case or whether we want to back off on the strength of this a bit.
Yeah, I had just this experience of creating maybe, I don't know, 10, 12 view definitions. These are the equivalent of the ones that for which we had the SQL version, like a Spark SQL version. And it happened to me that in most cases, like there are probably over 100 columns in all of those. In most cases, it's a string, and I only needed to specify the or decimal or things like that. So I don't know. I mean, I see your point also making profile validation easier, but I think it seems to me that, in more like a big number of cases, it's mostly a string. So
John?
Yeah, I was just thinking, so the reason that we had this on the agenda was because the reference implementation has trouble actually sort of doing this checking, I think, because it's just JavaScript and its result is a number. I mean, and then you're asking it to sort of say, was this a decimal? Like, is this a decimal or is this an integer? So maybe this is actually pointing to a little bit of a problem for some implementations that don't implement full type checking, that it's hard for them to actually throw an error if the asserted type is not the same as the result type. So I was just sort of pointing that out, but I haven't fully thought it through because I haven't dived into the reference implementation, tried to fix this problem, but I do know that it doesn't pass that currently.
Yeah, and we can determine. I mean, I think it could be fair generally for our error handling semantics, we've been reluctant to use must assertions in implementation error handling. So and leaving implementations like should report errors in whatever way best fits that implementation. So in the JavaScript implementation, maybe there's just not a good way to as strictly enforce some of these typing considerations. And I think that's okay. I think just from a perspective of this, if we kind of thinking about the view definition as a standalone artifact, I mean, it's like if you run against FHIR data, this is what we would expect to get out. I think that we're interested in how concretely we want to define that here. And implementation should, ideally catch, I mean, in an ideal world, they catch everything and make sure that. But if there's implementations that for some reason can't do a strong type checking, I think that's probably okay as well.
Yeah, and now that I look at it, it is should. So maybe this can't really be a test specifically. Yeah, because it won't pass the reference implementation.
Okay, so not a test in the sense of, I mean, what specifically?
So, for example, an example of a test might be that will pass on the reference implementation. It would throw an error on, say, the pathling implementation. But I think that's fine. Maybe we just need to be tolerant of that sort of situation.
Yeah, I think that seems okay. I think this is an area where should is appropriate, and maybe at some point we can strengthen the engine. And I mean, there's something we can do in the reference implementation to try to catch that. But yeah, I understand that the fact that JavaScript itself is not strongly typed can add some challenges in that space.
John, do we have such a test right now? I think I'm not sure if I saw that. So do we have a test that we specify wrong type and then we expect that to fail?
Yeah, so there's a Zulip topic called decimal numbers and type assertions. And there's a test where we get an observation and we do a whole bunch of different arithmetic operations, and we also assert the type of those things. And I noticed that the type of those things of some of those things was actually wrong, but it was passing the reference implementation anyway. So for example, we had like a value of type range within an observation, which is actually a decimal. And we were doing addition and subtraction with that, which of course, returns a decimal in terms of fire path and fire, but we were asserting it as an integer and it was passing anyway. But if you were actually doing all the proper sort of type, like implementing types all the way through, and you were also checking that the assertion matched the result, you would probably say that's wrong because a decimal plus a decimal should be a decimal, right? So that's the test case that triggered me.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. I think in our implementation, I also do not check types, like for when I incorporated the tests.
Yeah.
What was the takeaway from that discussion? Do we have an action item?
Well, I think I thought the action item was to add another test to tighten it up, but now I think maybe we can't do that. But possibly we should change that test to be right, but it won't matter so much like for some implementation. So I think that the action is to still create an issue relating to the decimal numbers and type assertion thread on Zulu, but the actual action might be a little bit watered down on what I thought it might be.
So if I am looking at I think I'm looking at the right test. And so right now it doesn't fail, right? Like, in the expect section, there is no failure. So this is the fire path underlying numbers that JSON, correct?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so the expectation is just like a set of columns. So that, yeah, I mean, currently that is what the end result that you want it to be, right? You are thinking that, it should be. So I guess your proposal was to change it. And now you're just saying that, we should just leave it, right? Or are you saying that, we should fix the type?
I think we should fix the type so that it will pass for implementations that do check it.
That check, okay.
Because it will pass for the reference implementation regardless. But if I ran this through pathlink, for example, it would fail because it would say this is not an integer for, say, the added numbers. So I think we just update the types to what they should be, and that's the action.
Yeah, and just with the understanding that all implementations will not, things won't be relevant to all implementations. That could even be I'd recommend that being a comment in the test if somebody happens upon it in the future. Okay, great. Thanks, John. I added a to-do to create an issue from the Zulu thread to fix that test and update the type. Great. So we have run through all of the, I think, substantive issues. We don't have very much time left. And so still on the docket into the future that it's kind of rolling over maybe for next week, we wanted to continue to discuss in the broader group about extensibility, potentially FirePath functions outside the spec or potentially even custom functions. And then, we've had a couple of goes at discussing how view definitions might target multiple resource types. So just wanted to put that out there for folks to start thinking about. And then the last sort of administrative item is that we wanted to have Parquet on Fire focused conversation. And so I will put up a poll for that going out the next month or so. We are into April and, May is coming up. So that's exciting for the Milestone 1 release. But so I'll put up a poll for that and have folks who are interested in Parquet specifically, I'll open up a thread to add agenda items. So that is all I had for today. So is everyone who is working on the bulk export is also following the discussions like that we have here and the Zulip threads and everything? The reason I'm asking is that potentially the Parquet on Fire discussion is relevant to that as well. So it would be nice to make sure that everybody from that community is also involved, like at least be the know.
So I am involved in both, and we have a project this year that's focused on optimizing bulk export. But I do want to set expectations there because the actual areas for optimization have been brought by users with use cases that are focused on like, can we even get the data we need out? Can we apply filters? Can we group data by patient or by encounter instead of by resource type? Those are most of the use cases that seem to be going into the project. But I would encourage you, there's the Argonaut channel on Zulip. We just launched the project this past week, and the plan is to have weekly meetings on Wednesday afternoons. So if that's an area that it makes sense to dive in on, there is a community around it. It tends to be a community that's pretty focused on expanding the capabilities of the current EHR requirements, and those are regulated capabilities. So they feel pretty high stakes for the vendors involved. They have to show kind of compliance in order to keep their systems certified.
Josh, you said there's this Zulip channel for That's what you're saying.
Well, yeah, there's a couple that are relevant.
Okay.
The project that's running this year is under the Argonaut Standards Accelerator. So the Argonaut stream on Zulip is certainly one relevant one. And then there's also the bulk data stream that's particular to this topic that's been going on for many years. So those are kind of the community places.
Okay, great. I just wanted to clarify that for myself. And Dan is not on the call, but I'm assuming Dan is also.
Sorry, yeah, Dan is leading that project for Argonaut.
Right. Okay, great, great. Yeah, terrific. So, right. So I think that we'll probably, I think Bashir, for you and other folks who are interested in the evolution of the bulk FHIR project. So I think those will be good places and communities to tie into. I think otherwise for us, specifically in terms of the RK outputs, we'll sort of go on our own here. And, there's definitely enough people in both communities to help align them if there's any possibility of alignment there. I see Alex, you have your hand up. Your mic, I can't hear you.
That's because it's up there. All right, thank you. I know we're running out of time, but quickly, I'm looking at the required core FHIR expressions functions section of the documentation, and it says we need literals for string, integer, and decimal. Does that mean we don't need to deal with, from a FHIR perspective, of like date, time, and time, or is that just missing from the wording here? Because I see later we need stuff to do with period. So I just want to double check.
I think it means that you need not support literals for those things. Potentially we'll still have date, time typed expressions in the mix there.
Okay.
But you need not have the ability to deal with the literal form of the date or date time, is my understanding of it.
It makes sense.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting that you're having a go at sort of building your own FHIR implementation. So I think that's really valuable experience to feed into this. Most of the implementation that we've done has been based on existing FHIR implementations, which, already greatly exceed the scope of this sort of minimum subset. So have a go and let us know how you go. And if we need to tweak the spec, we're certainly open to your experience in trying to implement that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I've been working on, like, at least this whole year and some last year, just in general from the ground up, building a bunch of tools in C++ to work with FHIR. And I'm actually doing a talk at Dev Days in June on my experience in trying to get this to work. But yeah, I've had to build my own like deserializer for the how to get it into just the memory, and then auto-generating structs in C++ to use them and all that stuff. But I have most of the FHIR done for the subset, and it's really nice that there is a subset because it's a lot easier to do just that amount. But yeah, I'll keep everyone updated, and I appreciate you guys having me in today and answering my questions.
Yeah, the other thing I'd really encourage you to do is take a look at the test folder, those JSON test definitions, and if there's any way that you can hook them up to your implementation, even in just a sort of preliminary fashion, to see how you're going against those tests, that would really help us validate the tests and validate the spec in general.
Yeah, certainly. Where can I find those?
In the SQL on FHIR repository, SQL on FHIR v2, which we can post a link to, there's a test subdirectory and there's a set of JSON files in there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I found them.
And it's a pretty basic sort of schema. It's really just a bit of test data and test definitions, which include like a view and an expectation. So you can run those through your implementation. Okay, if I ran this view definition and I got this result, does it match the expectation within each of these tests?
That's great. I was going to make my own, but I'm so glad there's some here already. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, I think that's a great, future step. Like Alex and I literally just connected on this
last week, right? Like last Friday. So yeah, same advice as John, go through the spec, in areas that are confusing or are unclear or not well defined, like
open up GitHub tickets is generally the way we do it, or if there's a long
Okay.
discussion, a Zula thread so we can discuss it. But yeah, it's really interesting. And then, once this rolls around, we're excited because we can now add you to eventually to the test matrix, which I don't know if I showed you, but
Yeah.
I think that's where John is going. So you got your own column for C++, which is exciting.
All right. Thank you.
All right, great. Looks like we're at time. So yeah, as usual, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day.